CEO took his mute daughter to the playground and froze when a poor boy used sign language to speak to her and surprised everyone with an act. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Richard Matthews adjusted his Italian leather watch and glanced around Riverside Park with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to evaluating everything in terms of investment potential. Even this simple Tuesday afternoon outing with his 7-year-old daughter Emma felt like another appointment to check off his impossibly busy schedule. "Go ahead, sweetheart," he said softly, watching Emma's golden curls bounce as she ran toward the colorful playground equipment. His heart clenched, as always, when he saw her move in complete silence. No giggles, no shouts of joy like the other children. Just his beautiful, silent little girl navigating a world that had stolen her voice 3 years ago. Richard settled onto a pristine bench, his $1,000 suit looking wildly out of place among the casual parents and caregivers. He pulled out his phone, already mentally shifting to the quarterly board meeting tomorrow, when something extraordinary happened that would stop his world completely. A scruffy boy with sun-bleached blonde hair was sitting alone on the swing set, his worn sneakers dragging in the dirt. Richard barely noticed him until the boy looked up and saw Emma approaching the monkey bars. What happened next made Richard's phone slip from his trembling fingers. The boy's hands began moving in fluid, graceful motions. Sign language. He was speaking to Emma in sign language. Richard watched in stunned amazement as Emma's face lit up with the brightest smile he'd seen from her in months. Her small hands moved back, responding in the visual language she'd learned, but rarely had the chance to use with children her own age. For the first time since her mother's death, Emma was having a real conversation with another child. The boy couldn't have been more than 7 himself, with intelligent green eyes that seemed far too wise for his age. His clothes were clean, but clearly hand-me-downs, and his shoes had been repaired with duct tape. Everything about him screamed poverty, yet he was giving Emma something Richard's millions couldn't buy: genuine friendship and understanding. "Your daughter," came a gentle voice beside him. Richard turned to see an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes settling onto the bench. "She's beautiful. My grandson Tommy there lost his best friend last year. Deaf boy from his school. Tommy insisted on learning sign language to talk with him. Now he practices with anyone who'll let him." Richard's throat constricted as he watched his daughter actually laugh. A silent, joyful expression he'd almost forgotten she was capable of. She doesn't usually connect with other children. "Tommy has a gift for finding the lonely ones," the woman said quietly. "Been through enough himself to recognize it in others." As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the playground, Richard made a decision that would change everything. He stood up, straightened his tie, and walked toward the 2 children who were now engaged in what appeared to be an animated conversation about the merits of different climbing equipment. But as he approached, Tommy looked up at him with those startling green eyes, and Richard felt something shift deep in his chest. There was something hauntingly familiar about this boy, something that made Richard's carefully controlled world suddenly feel very small and very fragile. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice rougher than intended, "for talking with Emma." Tommy's response, delivered in perfect sign language that Emma quickly translated with excited gestures, would haunt Richard for days to come. "I told her that sometimes the best conversations happen without any sound at all." But it was what Tommy said next, spoken aloud in a voice barely above a whisper, that would change everything. "Mister, haven't I seen you somewhere before?" Richard stared at Tommy for several long seconds, his mind racing through boardroom faces, business dinners, charity galas. Nothing. Yet something about those green eyes tugged at memories just beyond his reach, like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. "I'm not sure, son," Richard said carefully, crouching down to Tommy's eye level. What's your last name? Henderson, the boy replied, then quickly returned to signing with Emma, as if the adult conversation was far less interesting than planning their next playground adventure. His small hands moved with surprising fluency, telling Emma about a secret fort he'd discovered behind the climbing structure. Henderson. Richard rolled the name around in his mind, like a stone seeking its place. Still nothing concrete, yet an uncomfortable sensation settled in his stomach, like cold lead. "Tommy, time to go," called his grandmother, approaching with a worn canvas bag slung over her shoulder. Up close, Richard could see the careful mending in her clothing, the way she moved with the deliberate pace of someone managing chronic pain. Her shoes were practical but worn thin at the heels, and her hands bore the rough texture of someone who'd worked hard her entire life. "Mrs. Henderson," Richard found himself saying, extending his hand. "Richard Matthews, thank you for letting Tommy play with Emma. It's been special for her." The woman's eyes widened slightly at his name, and Richard caught something, a flicker of recognition, maybe fear, before she composed herself with practiced grace. Her handshake was firm despite her age, and her eyes held an intelligence that made Richard feel suddenly transparent. "Of course, Mr. Matthews. Tommy doesn't get many chances to practice his signing." She paused, studying Richard's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You look familiar. Have we met before? Perhaps at some community event?" Before Richard could respond, Tommy tugged on his grandmother's sleeve, signing rapidly. Emma watched with fascination, picking up new words and mimicking Tommy's movements. The children's silent conversation was animated, full of the natural enthusiasm that seemed to flow between them, like electricity. "Tommy asks if Emma can come play again tomorrow. Same time?" Mrs. Henderson translated, though her voice carried an undertone Richard couldn't quite identify. Richard looked at his daughter, whose eyes held more hope than he'd seen in years. Emma had been so withdrawn since her mother's death, so locked in her silent world. But here, with this boy, she was alive again. Yes, we'll be here." As the Hendersons walked away, Richard watched Tommy's grandmother lean down to whisper something urgent in the boy's ear. Her words were too quiet to hear, but her tone was unmistakably serious. Whatever she said made Tommy turn back to look at Richard with an expression far too serious for a 7-year-old, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that the adults around him had created. That night, Richard stood in his penthouse office, staring out at the glittering city lights below. Emma was asleep, probably dreaming of her new friend and their plans for tomorrow. But Richard couldn't shake the feeling that today had set something in motion, something that might unravel more than he was prepared to face. He pulled out his laptop and typed Henderson into his private investigators database. The search would take until morning, but he had to know. Something about that woman's recognition, about Tommy's two wise eyes, about the way the name Henderson seemed to echo in the empty spaces of his memory. Some connections, he was beginning to realize, might be worth more than money could measure. And some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of finding the light. The private investigator's report arrived at 6 a.m. via encrypted email, just as Richard was finishing his morning coffee in the pristine silence of his kitchen. 3 pages of dense information about the Henderson family, but one paragraph made his blood run cold and his carefully ordered world tilt on its axis. Subject: Dorothy Henderson, age 67, widowed 2019. Son deceased: James Henderson, died September 15, 2018, age 32. Grandson: Thomas Henderson, age 7, born March 3, 2017. Note: James Henderson was employed as construction foreman on Matthews' development project, the Jugger 47, Riverside District, 2017-2018. Died from injuries sustained in workplace accident involving faulty scaffolding equipment. Richard's coffee mug shattered against his marble floor, the dark liquid spreading like an accusation across the white stone. Matthew's development project Nutter 47, the luxury condos that had made him an additional $50 million. The project where corner cutting had led to. He forced himself to think the words. Had led to that accident. The accident he'd buried in paperwork and legal settlements, hoping never to think about it again. James Henderson. Richard remembered now. Not the face, but the name on the settlement paperwork. The young man who'd fallen from faulty scaffolding because Richard's construction manager had used substandard safety equipment to save costs. The man who'd left behind a wife, a mother, and a newborn son named Tommy. Richard had signed the settlement check personally. $200,000. A fortune to them, lunch money to him. He'd thought it was generous at the time, even progressive. His lawyers had suggested half that amount. Now that baby was 7 years old, sitting alone on swings, teaching sign language to Richard's daughter with the patience of someone who understood loneliness intimately. "Daddy." Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for their playground visit. Her excited expression stopped his spiraling thoughts cold. She was wearing her favorite yellow dress, the one she saved for special occasions, and had even attempted to braid her own hair. "Ready to see Tommy?" he managed to ask, his voice barely steady. Emma nodded enthusiastically, signing her response with movements that were becoming more confident each day. "He's my best friend. He makes me feel like talking is possible again." Best friend. Richard closed his eyes. Tommy Henderson was the son of the man whose death Richard's negligence had caused, and now he was Emma's best friend. The irony was so cruel, it took his breath away. As they drove to the park, Richard's hands shook on the steering wheel. Should he confess immediately, disappear from their lives, pretend he didn't know? Each option felt like a betrayal of someone. Emma, Tommy, James Henderson's memory, or his own conscience. But when they arrived and he saw Tommy's face light up at the sight of Emma, when he watched his daughter sign, "I missed you," with genuine joy, Richard realized he was facing a choice that would define not just his life, but the kind of man he wanted Emma to remember as her father. The question was, what kind of man did he want to be? The kind who ran from hard truths, or the kind who faced them, no matter the cost? "You know, don't you?" Dorothy Henderson's voice was quiet, but steady, as she sat beside Richard on their usual bench. 3 days of playground meetings had led to this moment, each day building tension like a storm gathering strength. Richard didn't pretend to misunderstand. The pretense had become too heavy to carry. "I know about James. I thought you might. Tommy has your eyes, you know. Same shape, same way of looking at the world, like you're calculating its worth." She paused, watching her grandson push Emma on the swings with careful attention to her comfort. "That's what I told my son when the baby was born. He has eyes like that rich man who came to the hospital." The words hit Richard like a physical blow, stealing his breath. "I came to the hospital? You don't remember." It wasn't a question, and her tone held no surprise. "Course not, why would you? Just another poor family to you, another check to write, but you came, brought white roses, told James's wife you were sorry for our loss, even held Tommy for a few minutes while she signed papers." Richard's mind reeled. He had no memory of visiting the hospital, yet he must have. In those guilt-ridden weeks after the accident, he'd done many things to try to assuage his conscience. Charitable donations, safety upgrades on other projects, even therapy sessions he'd never admitted to anyone. "I should have done more," he whispered, the admission scraping his throat raw. "Money can't bring back the dead, Mr. Matthews. We learned to live with what we had, but watching you with Emma now, seeing how much she means to you." Dorothy's voice caught. "It makes me wonder what kind of man you really are, underneath all that guilt." They watched their grandchildren in silence. Emma was teaching Tommy a new sign, something she'd learned from her therapist. Tommy was showing Emma how to braid dandelion stems into a crown, his young fingers surprisingly deft at the delicate work. "He asks about his daddy sometimes," Dorothy continued, her voice thick with memory. "I tell him his father was a good man who worked hard to build things for people. I don't tell him that the people he built for cared more about profit than his life. I don't tell him that his father died because someone decided saving money was worth more than saving lives." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking. Richard wanted to defend himself, to explain about business pressures and competitive bids and industry standards. But watching Tommy carefully place the dandelion crown on Emma's head, seeing his daughter's silent joy, all his justifications crumbled to dust. "What can I do?" Richard asked finally, his voice breaking on the words. Dorothy turned to study his face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read character in the lines around people's eyes. "That depends. Are you asking because you feel guilty, or because you actually care about that boy? Because guilt fades, Mr. Matthews, but caring, that changes everything." The question pierced straight through Richard's carefully constructed defenses. As he watched Tommy patiently help Emma down from the monkey bars, as he saw his daughter's silent laughter at something her friend had signed, Richard realized the answer. He cared, more than he'd cared about anything in years. More than profits or reputation or even his own comfort. But caring, he was about to learn, would come with a price he'd never anticipated. The eviction notice was crumpled in Dorothy Henderson's trembling hands when Richard arrived at the park the next afternoon. Tommy sat beside her on the bench, his usual bright demeanor replaced by confusion and worry that seemed too heavy for his small shoulders. 3 days, Dorothy said without looking up, her voice hollow with defeat. That's what they're giving us to find somewhere else to live. Richard's throat constricted, as if invisible hands were squeezing it. What happened? Landlords sold the building to developers. New owners want everyone out for renovations. She laughed bitterly, the sound like breaking glass. Luxury condos, probably. High-end units for people with money. Seems fitting, doesn't it? Emma was already running toward Tommy, but stopped short when she saw his dejected posture. Her little face crumpled with concern as she signed to him, her movements quick and worried. Tommy's response was brief, resigned, his hands moving with the weariness of someone far older than 7. "What did he tell her?" Richard asked, though he dreaded the answer. That sometimes people have to move away, even when they don't want to. That sometimes homes disappear like everything else good in life. Dorothy's voice carried the weight of too many losses. He doesn't understand why the world keeps taking things away from him. Richard watched his daughter's world begin to crack. The first real friend she'd found since her mother's death, and now he was being taken away. Just like everything else, precious in her life seemed to vanish without warning or explanation. There must be other places, Richard began desperately. With what money? Dorothy's voice carried decades of exhaustion and bitter experience. We're living on my social security and the little bit I make cleaning houses 3 days a week. James's insurance money went to medical bills and the funeral expenses. That settlement you gave us? Gone the first year just trying to survive, trying to keep food on the table and heat in the apartment. Richard felt something fracture inside his chest, a sharp pain that stole his breath. His settlement, meant to ease his conscience and close a legal liability, had barely kept them afloat for 12 months. And now they were losing their home, their stability, everything. Tommy doesn't know the whole truth, Dorothy continued quietly, her voice barely audible above the playground sounds. About how his father really died. About who you are. About what your company did to our family. I thought maybe it was better that way. But watching him with Emma these past weeks, seeing how much joy they bring each other. She trailed off, tears threatening to spill over. What haven't you told him? That his father died because someone decided profits mattered more than safety. That corners were cut on equipment that should have kept him alive. That the man whose daughter has become his best friend is the same man who signed those settlement checks while my son was lying in the morgue, while his wife was crying herself to sleep every night. The words were daggers, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Richard watched Tommy trying to cheer up Emma, the boy's natural kindness shining through his own worry like sunlight through storm clouds. "I have money," Richard said desperately, the words tumbling out. "I can help with the rent, find you a new place, something better. And then what?" Dorothy's eyes blazed with sudden fire. "You throw money at us until your guilt goes away, until Tommy gets old enough to ask the right questions, until Emma learns the truth about who her father really is?" Before Richard could respond, Tommy approached them with Emma in tow. The boy's face was grave beyond his years, carrying a seriousness that made Richard's heart ache. "Mr. Matthews," Tommy said carefully, his voice small but determined, "can I ask you something important?" Richard's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. "Of course, Tommy. If someone you loved was in trouble, what would you do to help them? Even if it was really, really hard." The innocent question contained depths that made Richard's vision blur. Here was James Henderson's son, asking about love and sacrifice, while his father's killer struggled to find words that wouldn't be lies. "I'd do whatever it took," Richard whispered, the truth scraping his throat raw, "no matter what it cost me." Tommy nodded solemnly, then turned to sign something lengthy to Emma. Her response was immediate and emphatic, her small hands moving with passionate conviction. "What did you tell her?" Richard asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Tommy looked up with those devastating green eyes that Richard now realized held flecks of gold, just like his own, just like Emma's. "I told her that sometimes grown-ups can fix things that seem impossible. And she said she believes you can fix anything because you're the best daddy in the whole world." The trust in Emma's face, the hope in Tommy's voice, and the weight of Dorothy's knowing stare converged into a moment that would haunt Richard forever. Because fixing this would require destroying everything he thought he knew about himself. Richard stood in his lawyer's office at 11 p.m., staring at documents that would change everything. Outside, Manhattan glittered with the lights of a city that never slept, but Richard felt like he was drowning in darkness deeper than any he'd ever known. "You understand what you're proposing?" Marcus Webb said carefully, his voice heavy with concern. Marcus had been Richard's attorney for 15 years, had helped build his empire from the ground up, had navigated hostile takeovers and billion-dollar deals. But this was territory neither of them had ever explored. The document spread across the mahogany table represented the largest personal financial commitment Richard had ever made. Not just money for rent or a new apartment for the Hendersons, something far more significant, far more permanent. "The Henderson Trust," Richard read aloud from the top page, his voice steady despite the earthquake in his chest. "Educational funds, medical coverage, housing security, living expenses. $2 million managed independently by First National Bank with Mrs. Dorothy Henderson as primary beneficiary and Thomas Henderson as secondary beneficiary upon reaching age 18. "It's generous beyond measure," Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair. "But Richard, you have to know this won't bring James Henderson back. It won't change what happened. And legally, you're opening yourself up to—" "I know what I'm opening myself up to," Richard interrupted, "but it might change what happens next. It might give Tommy a chance his father never had." The irony wasn't lost on him. The same development project that had killed Tommy's father was now generating rental income that could secure Tommy's future. Blood money transformed into something resembling hope. "There's something else," Richard said, his voice barely audible. "I want to tell them the truth. All of it. About the accident, about my company's role, about why James Henderson really died." Marcus went very still, his pen freezing mid-stroke. "Richard, Think about what you're saying. You're protected legally. The settlement agreement includes non-disclosure clauses. You could face criminal charges if someone decides to pursue this. The settlement agreement protected me from lawsuits, not from doing the right thing. Richard picked up his pen, then set it down again, his hands trembling. That boy trusts me. His grandmother looks at me and sees the man who killed her son, but she's too kind to say it directly. And my daughter, he paused, overcome by emotion. Emma believes I can fix anything. How can I let her grow up thinking her father is some kind of hero when you're actually what? A man trying to make amends. A father who loves his daughter enough to face his mistakes. A man who let greed kill an innocent person, Richard finished quietly. Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious. You realize what this could cost you, beyond the money. Your reputation, your business relationships, possibly your freedom if prosecutors decide to pursue criminal charges. Your board of directors will demand explanations. Your investors will panic. You could lose everything you've built. Richard thought about Tommy's dandelion crown on Emma's head, about the way the boy had learned sign language to talk to a classmate he barely knew, about Dorothy Henderson cleaning other people's houses to keep food on their table, while the man responsible for her son's death lived in a penthouse worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. What's it cost them? Richard asked simply. What's it cost a 7-year-old boy to grow up without his father? What's it cost a grandmother to raise a child on Social Security? What's it cost Emma to lose the first real friend she's had since her mother died? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything they'd built their careers on. Richard picked up his pen again, and this time he didn't put it down. His signature on the trust documents was steady, but signing the letter to Dorothy Henderson, the letter explaining everything, confessing his company's negligence, accepting full responsibility for James Henderson's death, made his hand shake so violently he had to rewrite it twice. As he sealed the envelope, Richard realized he was about to discover something that terrified him more than any business deal or financial loss, whether redemption was even possible for a man who had spent 7 years running from the truth. Tomorrow he would find out if love could survive honesty, and whether a 7-year-old boy could forgive the man who had taken his father away. Richard's hands trembled as he approached Dorothy Henderson's apartment building at dawn. The envelope containing his confession and the trust documents felt heavier than any contract he'd ever signed. The building was worse than he'd imagined. Peeling paint, broken mailboxes, the smell of mildew and desperation in the narrow hallway. He knocked softly on apartment 3B, knowing it was too early but unable to wait another moment. The weight of 7 years of lies was crushing him. Dorothy answered in a worn bathrobe, her silver hair unpinned, but her eyes immediately alert. Behind her, Richard could see a tiny apartment made smaller by careful organization. A fold-out couch that served as Tommy's bed, a kitchenette with dishes stacked neatly in a dish rack, photographs of James covering every available surface. "Mr. Matthews?" she said, surprised. "It's 6 in the morning. I couldn't wait." Richard's voice was hoarse from a sleepless night. "I have something for you, something I should have given you 7 years ago." She stepped aside, letting him into the cramped space. Tommy was still asleep on the couch, his blonde hair tousled, one small hand clutching a worn, stuffed dog. Even in sleep he looked like his father. Richard could see it now in the shape of his nose, the determined set of his jaw. "Coffee?" Dorothy offered, but Richard shook his head. "Please, just read this." He handed her the envelope with shaking fingers. Dorothy opened it slowly, her weathered hands careful with the expensive paper. As she read, her face went through a transformation. Surprise, then understanding, then something Richard couldn't quite identify. Pain, relief, anger. The trust documents lay on her small kitchen table like a promise and an accusation combined. $2 million, more money than she'd see in several lifetimes. "Why now?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. "After all these years, why tell the truth now?" "Because Tommy taught my daughter how to laugh again. Because he sits alone on swings and still has kindness left in his heart. Because you've been cleaning houses while I've been living in a penthouse built on your son's blood." Richard's voice broke. "Because I can't look at Emma and pretend to be the hero she thinks I am." Dorothy sat down heavily in a mismatched chair, the letter still in her hands. "You know this changes everything. Between Tommy and Emma, between you and everything." "I know. You know this could destroy you financially, legally, personally." "I know." She studied his face in the dim morning light, filtering through threadbare curtains. "And you're doing it anyway. I'm doing it because it's right, and because, for the first time in 7 years, I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror." Tommy stirred on the couch, mumbling something in his sleep. Both adults froze, but he didn't wake. "He'll have questions," Dorothy said softly, "hard questions. About his father, about you, about why we've been struggling when you could have helped us all along. I'll answer them. All of them. Whatever he needs to know." Dorothy folded the letter carefully, her movements deliberate. "Mr. Matthews, Richard, I need you to understand something. That money, this trust, it's generous beyond measure. But Tommy doesn't need your money half as much as he needs to understand why his father died. And more than that, he needs to know that the man his new best friend calls Daddy is someone worth respecting." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "And if I'm not worth respecting, then you better become someone who is. Because that little boy is about to learn that the world is more complicated and cruel than he imagined, and Emma is about to learn that her father isn't the perfect man she thought he was." Dorothy's eyes hardened. "They're both going to need you to be stronger than you've ever been before." As if summoned by her words, Tommy opened his eyes, blinking in the early morning light. When he saw Richard sitting in their kitchen, his face lit up with the innocent joy that made Richard's heart break a little more. "Mr. Matthews, are you here for breakfast? Grandma makes really good pancakes." Richard looked at this beautiful, trusting child, James Henderson's son, and realized that the hardest part wasn't confessing his sins. The hardest part was going to be living with the consequences. "Tommy, come sit with me, sweetheart." Dorothy's voice was gentler than usual as she patted the couch beside her that evening. Richard had left hours ago, but his confession still lay on the kitchen table like an unexploded bomb. Tommy bounced over, his energy infectious despite the day's somber mood. He'd spent the afternoon asking when he'd see Emma again, not understanding why the adults around him seemed so tense. "I need to tell you something important about your daddy," Dorothy began, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled Tommy close. "Is this about the pictures?" Tommy asked, gesturing toward the shrine of photographs covering their living room wall. "Or about how he died building things?" Dorothy's breath caught. "What do you mean, honey?" "I know he fell, Grandma. I know he got hurt at work and that's why he died. I'm not little anymore." Tommy's voice carried a maturity that shouldn't have belonged to a 7-year-old. "I just don't understand why Emma's daddy gets so sad when he looks at me." The words hit Dorothy like a sledgehammer. "You've noticed that. He gets the same look Mama used to get before she went to the sad place." Tommy's voice was matter-of-fact, but his small hands twisted in his lap, like he wants to say something, but the words are stuck inside him. Dorothy closed her eyes, remembering Tommy's mother, beautiful, fragile Sarah, who'd never recovered from James's death, who'd spent 2 years drowning in grief and medication before the final breakdown that landed her in long-term psychiatric care. Tommy visited her once a month, but she rarely recognized him anymore. "Tommy, what if I told you that Mr. Matthews worked for the company where your daddy died?" That his company built the building where the accident happened. Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the serious concentration he brought to difficult puzzles. Is that why he's been so nice to us? Because he feels bad? Partly, yes. And is that why you get that angry look sometimes when you watch him with Emma? Dorothy stared at her grandson, realizing he'd been far more perceptive than she'd given him credit for. You've been watching us, haven't you? Trying to figure out what the grown-ups aren't saying. Tommy nodded solemnly. Grown-ups think kids don't notice things, but I notice everything. Like how Mr. Matthews's hands shake when he talks about his work. Like how you always say my daddy was taken from us instead of just saying he died. Like how Emma doesn't have a mommy but never talks about her. The insight was devastating in its accuracy. What else have you noticed? That Mr. Matthews looks at me sometimes like he's seeing someone else, and that you look at him like you want to forgive him for something but don't know how. Tommy turned to face his grandmother fully. Grandma, did Mr. Matthews do something bad to Daddy? Dorothy felt the moment crystallize around them. The end of Tommy's innocence, the moment when the world became infinitely more complicated. His company made choices that weren't safe. They used equipment that wasn't strong enough because it cost less money, and your daddy fell because of those choices. Tommy absorbed this information with a stillness that frightened Dorothy. When he finally spoke, his voice was small but steady. So Emma's daddy is the reason my daddy is dead? Yes. But he didn't want Daddy to die? No, sweetheart. I don't think he wanted anyone to die. I think he just didn't think about what might happen. Tommy was quiet for several minutes, staring at the photographs of his father. Finally, he stood up and walked to the wall, touching one picture. James in his construction helmet, grinning at the camera, his hard hat tilted at a jaunty angle. Daddy looks happy in this one, Tommy said softly. He looks like he loved building things. He did love it. He was proud of his work, even if the people he worked for weren't good to him. Dorothy felt tears building behind her eyes. Even then. Tommy turned back to her, his green eyes serious beyond his years. Grandma, if Mr. Matthews is sorry, and if he wants to make things better, and if Emma needs him to be her daddy, maybe Daddy would want us to forgive him. The wisdom in the question, the grace of it nearly broke Dorothy's heart. Here was James Henderson's son, finding compassion for the man responsible for his father's death. Maybe he would, she whispered. But Tommy, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean trusting someone until they prove they've really changed. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. Like how you taught me to be careful around dogs until I know if they're friendly? Exactly like that. Then I think, Tommy said carefully, I want to see what kind of man Emma's daddy really is. And I want him to see what kind of boy my daddy's son grew up to be. Dorothy pulled her grandson close, marveling at the strength in his small frame. James would have been so proud, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was just beginning. Richard knelt in front of Emma in their living room, her small hands clasped in his larger ones. The afternoon light streaming through their floor-to-ceiling windows seemed too bright for the conversation he was about to have. Princess, I need to tell you something important about Tommy and his family. Emma's face immediately clouded with worry. She signed rapidly, her movements quick and anxious. Is Tommy okay? Is he moving away? Are you going to make me stop seeing him? Tommy is okay, and no, I'm not going to make you stop seeing him, but I need to explain something about his daddy and about my work. Richard had rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but sitting here with Emma's trusting eyes on him, every carefully planned word crumbled away. You know how Mommy died in a car accident. How sometimes bad things happen even when nobody wants them to. Emma nodded, her expression growing more serious. Tommy's daddy died at work. He was building a building, and he fell because the equipment wasn't safe enough. Richard's voice caught. And the company he worked for was my company. I owned the company that didn't keep Tommy's daddy safe. Emma's hands went still. For a long moment she just stared at him, processing this information with the intense concentration she brought to difficult concepts. Then she signed a single, devastating question. Did you kill Tommy's daddy? The directness of it, the innocent clarity, nearly destroyed Richard. I didn't want him to die. I didn't know he was going to die. But I made choices about money that meant the equipment wasn't as safe as it should have been. So yes, in a way, I'm responsible for Tommy's daddy dying. Emma pulled her hands free from his and sat back, her expression cycling through confusion, hurt, and something that looked like betrayal. When she finally signed again, her movements were slow and deliberate. Does Tommy know? He knows now. His grandmother told him yesterday. Is that why you've been sad? Is that why you cry sometimes when you think I'm not looking? Richard felt his heart shatter. Even in her silent world, Emma saw everything. Yes, I've been carrying this secret for a long time, and it's been making me very sad. Are you a bad person? The question hung between them like a blade. Richard wanted to defend himself, to explain about business pressures and industry standards and the complexity of corporate responsibility. But looking at his daughter's face, he realized she deserved the truth, not excuses. I think I was a bad person for a while. I cared more about making money than about keeping people safe. And when Tommy's daddy died, I tried to forget about it instead of learning from it. He paused, struggling with the words. But meeting Tommy and his grandmother and seeing how much you care about him, it's made me want to be a better person. Emma studied his face with the intensity of someone much older than 7. When she finally signed again, her question surprised him. Does Tommy hate you now? I don't know. Maybe. He has every right to. Do you hate yourself? The question was so perceptive, so cutting, that Richard had to close his eyes for a moment. Sometimes, but hating myself doesn't help Tommy or his grandmother. It doesn't bring his daddy back, so I'm trying to figure out how to do better instead. Emma was quiet for several minutes, her small face scrunched in concentration. When she looked up again, her expression had changed. Still hurt, still confused, but also determined. I want to see Tommy. I want to tell him I'm sorry about his daddy. And I want to know if we can still be friends even though you did something bad. The maturity in her response, the wisdom of it, humbled Richard completely. Are you sure? This might be hard for both of you. Everything hard is still worth doing if it's right, Emma signed, unconsciously echoing something her mother used to say. Yes, Richard whispered. Yes, it is. But as they prepared to leave for the park, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation waiting for them there would test not just Tommy's capacity for forgiveness, but Emma's understanding of the complex, imperfect world she was growing up in. Some truths, once spoken, changed everything forever, and there was no going back. Tommy was waiting alone on the swings when Richard and Emma arrived at the park. No Dorothy, no other children, just a small boy moving back and forth in the late afternoon sun with the measured rhythm of someone deep in thought. When he saw them approaching, he stopped swinging but didn't get up. His expression was unreadable, not angry, not welcoming, just assessing. Emma ran ahead, her usual exuberance tempered by uncertainty. When she reached Tommy, she knelt in the sand beside his swing and began signing, her movements careful and deliberate. Richard watched from a distance, his heart pounding as the two children communicated in their silent language. Tommy's responses were brief at first, then longer, more animated. Whatever Emma was saying, it was drawing him out. Finally, Tommy looked over at Richard and gestured for him to come closer. Emma says she knows about my daddy now, Tommy said quietly when Richard reached them. "And she says you told her the truth about what you did." "Yes. She wants to know if we can still be friends." Richard looked between the two children, these 7-year-olds grappling with concepts that would challenge most adults. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that depends on you." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "On me?" Tommy stood up from the swing, and for a moment he looked far older than his 7 years. "Emma thinks you're the best daddy in the world, but I need to know what kind of man you really are before I can trust you with my best friend." Richard felt the world tilt around him. This wasn't the conversation he'd expected. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know if you remember coming to see my daddy in the hospital." The question came out of nowhere, hitting Richard like lightning. I'm not sure. I think I went, but I don't remember much about it." "Ah, I was there," Tommy said simply. "I was just a baby, but Grandma showed me pictures. You held me while Mama signed papers. Do you remember what you said to my daddy?" Richard's mouth went dry. "No, I don't remember." "You told him you were sorry. You told him you'd make sure his son would be okay." "Udrid." Tommy's voice was steady, but his eyes held depths that made Richard's chest ache. "You promised my daddy you'd take care of me." The words hit Richard like a tsunami of memory, fragments flooding back, the sterile hospital smell, the machines, a young man barely alive in the bed, Richard's own voice making promises he'd forgotten until this moment. I did say that. I remember now. And then you forgot about me for 7 years. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact, which somehow made it worse. "Yes, I forgot, I'm sorry." Tommy studied Richard's face with the intensity of someone conducting a crucial test. "But you remembered when you met me again, didn't you? That's why you've been so sad around me. That's why you keep looking at me like you've seen a ghost. You remind me of your father and of my promises." "Good." Tommy's response surprised Richard. "Because I've been testing you." "Testing me?" "Grandma told me who you were the first day we met. She recognized you from the hospital, from the pictures in the newspaper after Daddy died." Tommy's voice remained calm, matter of fact. "She wanted to leave right away, but I asked her to let me watch you for a while, to see what kind of man you really were." Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. "You've known all along." I've known you were the man who owned the company where my daddy died, but I didn't know if you were the kind of man who cared about keeping promises." Tommy glanced at Emma, who was watching their conversation with wide eyes. Emma needed a friend who understood what it was like to lose someone important. "And you needed to remember what you promised my daddy." The sophistication of it, the careful planning from a 7-year-old, left Richard speechless. "So, what's your verdict?" Richard asked finally. "What kind of man am I?" Tommy looked at Emma, then back at Richard. "You're the kind of man who forgot important things, but remembered them when it mattered. You're the kind of man who makes mistakes, but tries to fix them." He paused, considering. "And you're the kind of daddy who raised a daughter who thinks friendship is more important than being mad at someone." Emma signed something quickly, and Tommy nodded. "Emma wants to know if this means we can still be best friends." "What do you think?" Richard asked, his voice barely audible. Tommy stepped closer, his green eyes serious but no longer guarded. "I think my daddy would want his son to have good friends. And I think he'd want Emma to have a daddy who keeps his promises, even if it takes him a while to remember them." He extended his small hand toward Richard. "Do you promise to take care of Emma the way you promised to take care of me?" Richard knelt down to Tommy's eye level, tears streaming down his face. "I promise. And this time I won't forget." As they shook hands, Emma threw her arms around both of them, her silent joy radiating like sunshine. But Richard knew this was just the beginning. The real work, earning their trust, honoring his promises, becoming the man they believed he could be, was still ahead. The boardroom at Matthews Development felt like a courtroom as Richard faced his executive team the next morning. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, but the atmosphere was arctic. Word of the Henderson Trust had leaked overnight, and the vultures were circling. $2 million to the family of a deceased employee, CFO Margaret Wells read from her tablet, her voice dripping with disbelief, with a personal admission of negligence regarding safety protocols on Project 47. Richard, have you lost your mind? The safety protocols that saved the company $3 million in equipment costs, Richard replied quietly. The ones that cost James Henderson his life. That was 7 years ago, snapped VP of Operations Jack Morrison. We settled that case. It's done, buried, legally protected. Why are you digging up ancient history? Because it's not history to his 7-year-old son. The room fell silent. These people had built fortunes alongside Richard, had trusted his judgment through countless deals and crises. Now, they were looking at him like he'd suffered a complete breakdown. This isn't just about money, Margaret continued, her tone softening slightly. The media will crucify us. Our stock price will tank. Other families will come forward looking for similar settlements. You're opening us up to accountability, Richard finished, to taking responsibility for our choices. To financial ruin, Jack corrected. Richard, I've known you for 15 years. This isn't like you. What's really going on? Richard thought about Emma and Tommy at the park yesterday, about the handshake that felt like a sacred vow, about promises made in hospital rooms and forgotten in penthouses. What's going on is that I met James Henderson's son, and he's a better person at 7 than I've been in 43 years. The statement hung in the room like a challenge. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Dorothy. Tommy wants to invite Emma for dinner tonight. If you're willing to eat spaghetti in a tiny apartment instead of whatever rich people usually eat. Despite everything, Richard smiled. There's something else, he said, turning back to his executives. I'm implementing new safety protocols across all our sites. Industry leading, not industry standard. It'll cost us approximately $12 million annually. $12 million? Margaret's voice hit a register that probably alarmed dogs in neighboring buildings. The same amount we'd save if we had 1 fewer safety incident per year. The same amount that might have saved James Henderson's life. Richard, Jack leaned forward, his expression concerned. I think you need to step back, take some time. This guilt is clouding your judgment. My judgment has never been clearer. Richard stood, gathering his papers. I'm not doing this because I feel guilty. I'm doing it because it's right, and because I want my daughter to grow up knowing her father is someone worth respecting. And if the board removes you, if the shareholders revolt, if the company collapses under the weight of your conscience. Richard paused at the boardroom door. Then at least it'll collapse while doing the right thing. As he walked toward the elevator, Richard's phone rang. Emma's school. Mr. Matthews, this is Principal Rodriguez. Emma's had a wonderful day today. Her teacher says she's been more engaged than ever, more willing to interact with other students. We're not sure what's changed, but whatever you're doing at home is working beautifully. Richard leaned against the elevator wall, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and terror. Thank you for letting me know. There is one thing, though. She wrote something in her journal today that her teacher thought you should see. She wrote, My daddy used to be scared of being honest. But now he's brave enough to tell the truth even when it's hard. I want to be brave like him. The elevator doors opened, but Richard couldn't move. Mr. Matthews, are you there? Yes, he whispered. I'm here. As he drove toward Tommy and Dorothy's apartment that evening, take-out Chinese food cooling in the passenger seat, Richard realized that he might lose his company, his fortune, even his freedom. But for the first time in 7 years, he had something more valuable than all of that. He had the chance to be the man his daughter believed he was. And the man James Henderson's son was helping him become. 6 months later, Richard stood in the kitchen of Dorothy Henderson's new apartment, a spacious 3-bedroom place in a safe neighborhood with good schools, paid for by the trust fund, but chosen by Dorothy herself. The sound of children's laughter drifted from Tommy's room, where he and Emma were building an elaborate fort out of blankets and furniture. "The arraignment is next week," Richard said quietly, watching Dorothy slice vegetables for dinner. The criminal charges had come, as expected, corporate negligence resulting in death. His lawyers were confident about a plea deal, but prison time was still possible. "Are you scared?" Dorothy asked, not looking up from her chopping. "Terrified," Richard admitted. "Not of prison exactly, but of Emma having to visit her father behind bars, of Tommy thinking I'm just another adult who disappointed him." Dorothy set down her knife and turned to face him. "That boy has seen enough adults disappear from his life. You think he's going to write you off for paying the consequences of your choices?" Before Richard could answer, Emma appeared in the doorway, signing rapidly. Dorothy had been learning sign language, and her translation skills were improving daily. "She says Tommy wants to show you something," Dorothy interpreted, "something important." They walked to Tommy's room, where the children had constructed an impressive blanket fortress, complete with pillows, flashlights, and what appeared to be a detailed architectural plan drawn in crayon. "It's a safe house," Tommy explained proudly. "See these support beams?" He pointed to carefully positioned chair legs. Emma calculated the weight distribution. "And look at these safety features: multiple exits, soft landing zones, and reinforced corners." Richard knelt down to examine their work, amazed by the 7-year-old's attention to structural integrity. "This is incredible engineering." We're going to be partners when we grow up," Tommy announced matter-of-factly. "Henderson and Matthews Construction. But we're going to build things that keep people safe, not just make money." The words hit Richard like a lightning bolt of hope and redemption combined. "Henderson and Matthews?" "Emma's idea," Tommy said, grinning. "She says families should work together." Emma signed something, and Tommy nodded seriously. "She wants to know if you'll teach us about building things the right way, not the fast way or the cheap way, but the right way." Richard felt tears threatening. "I'd be honored to teach you anything you want to know." Good," Tommy said. Then his expression grew more serious. "Because we're going to need your help with something else too." "What's that?" Tommy exchanged a look with Emma, some silent communication passing between them. "We want to build a memorial for my daddy, something at the construction site where he died. Emma designed it." Emma pulled out a drawing from under her pillow, a detailed sketch of a small garden with a bench surrounded by strong, safe-looking structures. At the center was a plaque with words written in both English and sign language. "In memory of James Henderson and all workers who build our world, may we build safely with love." Richard's voice deserted him completely. The children watched him with the patient understanding of people who'd learned to navigate adult emotions. "The company that owns the site now," Dorothy said softly from the doorway, "they agreed to let us build it. The new owners are apparently much more interested in doing the right thing than the previous owners were." Richard looked up at her, confused. "Didn't I mention?" Dorothy's eyes held a spark of something that might have been amusement. "Matthews' development was purchased last month by Henderson Construction Consortium." Funny how these things work out. The revelation hit Richard like a physical blow. "You bought my company." Tommy and I thought it seemed appropriate. With the trust fund providing capital and your former executives willing to work under new management focused on safety and integrity, it seemed like a good investment. Richard stared at the woman he'd underestimated, the grandmother who'd turned his guilt money into something revolutionary. "You've been planning this all along." "Not planning, hoping. Hoping you become the kind of man worth partnering with." Emma tugged on Richard's sleeve, signing something urgent. When he looked confused, Tommy translated. "She says she has something to tell you, something she's been practicing." Emma took a deep breath, her small face scrunched with concentration. When she opened her mouth, Richard heard something he hadn't heard in 3 years. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice rusty from disuse but clear as crystal. "I'm proud of you." The words hung in the air like a miracle. Richard collapsed to his knees, pulling Emma into his arms as tears streamed down his face. "How?" he managed to ask. "Tommy taught me that sometimes the most important things need to be said out loud," Emma whispered, her voice growing stronger. "He taught me that silence is a choice, not a prison." Tommy beamed with pride. "She's been practicing every day, but she wanted to wait for the right moment." As Richard held his daughter and listened to her voice, tentative but determined, like someone stepping into sunlight after years in darkness, he realized that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a daily choice to be better than you were yesterday. "So," Dorothy said, wiping her own eyes, "are you ready to build something that matters?" Richard looked around the room, at Tommy's eager face, at Emma's radiant smile, at Dorothy's expression of cautious hope, at the blanket fort that represented everything they could create together. "Yes," he said, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Let's build something that lasts." Outside, the city hummed with its eternal rhythm of construction and destruction, dreams and disappointments. But in this small apartment, 3 generations were laying the foundation for something unprecedented, a future built on truth, strengthened by forgiveness, and designed to keep everyone safe. Some buildings, Richard was finally learning, were worth any price to construct properly, even if it took a lifetime to get the blueprints right.